thank you very much to John. It was nice to read out those endorsements from my parents on the back of the book there. And to Olivia LeBlanc at CUP, the festival organizers, thank you very much for coming. So my book starts with the following sentence. There are two main ways of approaching the study of revolution in the contemporary world, and they're both wrong. Now, I want to start by explaining what I mean by that. On the one hand, there's this notion that revolution is everywhere. You find it on the streets of Hong Kong, of Beirut, in Santiago, in Kobani, in Algeria and Sudan earlier this year, amidst the Naxalites of Central and Eastern India, now the world's longest running armed uprising, in the rhetoric of groups like Black Lives Matter and Extinction Rebellion, in the campaigns of Bernie Sanders, and amongst some Brexiteers. It's completely accidental that the Naxalites are pointing their guns at the Brexiteers, I can assure you. But the point here is that rarely does a week go by at the moment without a revolution of one kind or another being proclaimed. And it's not just about political movements, it's something that's crossed over into popular culture. So the highly popular musical Hamilton, the even more popular Star Wars series have eulogized revolutionary struggle. Now, something I do when I travel is I check out how revolution works in different domain names around the world. So I've got 3 examples here, but it's a game you are welcome to play when you travel as well. So revolution.com is the American version, and their revolution.com is a venture capitalist firm. Revolution.co.uk is a gaming company, a software company. And my favorite one, which is from Australia, where I spent some time last year, revolution.com.au, is a flea and heartworm treatment for your dogs and cats. Now, I don't know who came up with that, but I think it helps make the point that revolution has seeped through into everyday life in a way that's fairly confusing if we're trying to think about what this term actually means in the contemporary world. So the first position I think we have to contend with is this notion that revolution is everywhere, as popular movement, as political statement, as popular culture, and apparently as pet treatment. So that's one. The other position, I think, is the opposite, the apparently contradictory belief that revolution is nowhere. So with the passing of state socialism at the end of the Cold War between 1989 and 1991, there was this sense that the big issues of governance and economic development had largely been settled. That idea of revolution, big R, capital, social revolution, as programs of deep confrontation, systemic transformation, and world order making had largely gone. And they were being replaced by a different idea of revolutions, maybe small R revolutions, minor disturbances rather than deep challenge, pale imitations rather than these real, proper, authentic, what were once called social revolutions. So in that sense, revolution is nowhere. And the question I wanted to start with tonight, and I start the book with, is revolution everywhere or nowhere? And the answer, of course, is neither. So what I do in the book is really start with this core idea. That revolutions are processes that change in form across time and place. Now, because they do, that's something captured to some extent by that revolutions are everywhere idea, because what people are getting at here is the fragmentation of revolution in the contemporary world, that we seem to be using it to capture a very wide variety of processes. But I think that meaning, that understanding, is too loose. On the other hand, the people who are thinking about revolution and nowhere have effectively fixed an idea of revolution, that unless it looks like France, Russia, China, Cuba, or a couple of others, it's not really a revolution, therefore revolution belongs to the past. And I think the problem there is that that view is effectively too complacent. They don't see the enduring attempt to overturn existing injustices and generate alternative social orders. So what I try and do, and what I'll try and outline tonight, is think about, keep those both views in mind, try and think about this notion of revolution changing across time and place, make some remarks about how we might think about revolution in the contemporary world, but spend some time thinking about, if we take a longer view of revolutions, how might we draw some patterns about how they emerge, how they unfold, and how they end. So the starting point then, if we're thinking about the changing components of revolution, what are we looking for? We're looking for changing meanings. So once upon a time in Europe, revolution meant something circular, almost like the passing of seasons that just happened organically. And sometime in the late 18th century, that shifted to a notion of revolution as rupture, a sharp break, as a year zero from which there was no going back. And it might be that revolution is changing again in meaning in the contemporary world, and I'll come back to that. We have this idea that revolutions also change in character. Once upon a time, we associated them with vanguard parties or guerrilla movements, but certainly some armed struggle of some kind or another. And now we actually think of revolutions primarily as unarmed movement, people power, mass movements, the occupation of public places, and their reassessment and reconfiguration is something that belongs to the people rather than the regime. And again, I'll come back to that. The main actors in revolutions have changed. Once upon a time, we thought of the urban proletariat or maybe the third world guerrilla, and now again we have these huge coalitions that occupy public places, take huge part in huge demonstrations, take part in concerted, unarmed struggle. So we've got different ideas of what revolutions look like. And that means that the people who singularize revolution as this big capital R revolution, as France and Russia and China and Cuba and so on, I think are making three mistakes. The first is that the stories we tell about revolutions are often more myth than reality. I've always thought it was fairly odd that the practice in social science of revolution begins with France, a revolution that's usurped by Napoleon, then partly overturned by the Bourbons in 1815. More myth than reality, and not just France, plenty of other revolutions as well. So we don't necessarily get the story right. Second, I think we've spent too much time on self-proclaimed progressive movements. The Republican constitutionalist movements that dominated revolution in the 18th century, the state socialist movements of the 19th century, various post-colonial movements. And what we've missed are these radical conservative currents, from fascism to militant Salafism today, that actually look and smell a lot like revolutions, but are excluded because we often just don't like them. But that's a normative position. That's a political position. It's not a scholarly one. And I think we're missing a lot if we don't think about what people are attracted to in those movements, what they're fighting for, and what they'd like to do if they win. And again, I'll come back to that at the end of the talk. Finally, we've concentrated too much on outcomes. Almost every definition of revolution is about big change, major transformations. Now, if that's right, then by definition, you only ever look at successful cases, which you know sometime down the line, 5 years after, 10 years after, 30 years after, even if it's more myth than reality. We premise our study of revolutions on really a handful of cases, 10, 11, 12 very well-known cases that effectively are on a kind of repeat cycle. The problem there is that we're missing this whole world of revolutionary stuff, which I think is the technical term, for all of these revolutionary movements that often don't generate a revolutionary situation, and then lots of revolutionary situations that don't end up as successful revolutions. So we've missed all of that because we've only concentrated on the last bit, those that we think have had successful outcomes, sometime after the fact, some big enough transformation that we say, now you're a revolution. So we've missed out on all of these diverse revolutionary experiences, historical and contemporary, by thinking about revolutions as quintessentially progressive, as quintessentially successful, and often by not telling particularly accurate histories of them. So one of the starting points for the book is thinking about, well, if we didn't do that, if we thought about revolutions as this much more diverse set of experiences, attempts to generate these major transformations fairly quickly, forcefully, and some major social transformation, not necessarily successfully, but an attempt to do so, then we open up our understanding of revolution to a much wider corpus. And as a result, we might also spend some time explaining why we have so many movements that don't win. Why do we have relatively few successes, given that there's so much revolutionary stuff around us? And one of the reasons for that is because of successful counter-revolution by actors both in states and then sometimes outside states. I mean, how could you tell the story of the Arab uprisings in 2011 without the role of Saudi Arabia as a primarily counter-revolutionary force, often acting through the Gulf Cooperation Council, acting to push back revolution in various states, spending a lot of money, sending arms, and all the rest of it. So we often miss study of counter-revolution and fail to explain why lots of these movements are unsuccessful. So what I thought I'd do is sort of open things up a bit, think about these diverse experiences, try not to just concentrate on successful or progressive movements, and then from there, see what lessons could be drawn about how revolutions begin, what happens during them, and what happens afterwards. So let's begin at the beginning with how revolutions come about. This is the more or less standard way of thinking about revolutions. The thing to hold on to here is the notion that there is more than one political entity or political group in a society that's claiming the state. So it's a position of dual, or if you have more than two, multiple sovereignty. These are exclusive claims. You can't agree to different parts. You can't agree to a partition. These are exclusive claims to the same political unit. And there's some forceful, transgressive, extra-constitutional activity on both sides that are effectively duking it out. And you'll see here that there's a very close relationship between revolution and civil war. It's actually quite difficult, I think, to tell them apart. Think about Syria. Since 2011, it starts as a revolution and becomes a civil war, but I'm not completely clear when or on what basis. I mean, we might think of that still as a revolutionary, counter-revolutionary struggle, and it might open up something that we otherwise don't see that well. So three reasons, or three patterns that we find in terms of how one of these revolutionary situations emerges when we get these competing groupings. The first is shifting international relations. You find a close link between the emergence of revolutionary situations and big changes going on internationally. So, for example, imperial competition may be tied to a weaker empire and a stronger empire, or some type of imperial disintegration. That's there in the big Atlantic age of revolutions, the last quarter of the 18th century and the first quarter of the 19th century. The Spanish and the French, the Portuguese empires are becoming weaker, the British empire is becoming stronger, and into this inter-imperial competition comes various movements from below, waiting effectively for international relations to become more fluid, to become more open, as a way of seizing the moment. Same is also true of the beginning of the 20th century. You have this range of what's called constitutional revolutions as the Russian, Chinese, Ottoman, Persian empires are becoming much weaker. Depending on your view of what the Soviets were, you might say that the 1989 revolutions are associated with the weakening of the Soviet empire from parts of Central and Eastern Europe. You also get a close association between revolutions and war. So very often you'll get revolutionary expressions either in the midst of wars or afterwards. I mean, the obvious example is the 1917 revolution in Russia, which is very closely associated with the disaster of World War I. It's also true of relatively small wars, as they called, in the Third World, that were closely associated with revolutions in Algeria or Vietnam, elsewhere. Then you get this category of client-patron relations, which is really just a way of thinking about a state that's largely dependent on a more powerful backer. So here, the signal case is the Soviet system in Eastern and Central Europe, which effectively runs these satellite states. And time and again during the Cold War, the Soviets put down revolutions, or at least large uprisings in those states. East Germany, 1953, Hungary, 1956, Czechoslovakia, 1968. But what happens during the mid to late 1980s is Mikhail Gorbachev effectively says, we're not doing that anymore. Now it's up to you. You're going to have to stand or fail on your own back. You can't have the Soviet security umbrella behind you. So once that client-patron relation shift, that relations of dependence shifts, and those states are left effectively on their own, then again there's an opening for these movements from below to get somewhere that they couldn't previously. They don't hit the brick wall of the big power, effectively putting them in their place. And think about that as a contrast to the protesters in Hong Kong today. You know, as they protest, they're still going to hit the brick wall of China at some point. So if you don't have that opening, I would suggest to you don't have much chance of success. If you do have that opening, you've at least got a chance. And there's very different calculations that's made in some of those states at the time. Mikhail Gorbachev looks actually at Tiananmen Square. That happens on, I think, the 4th of June, 1989, and says, well, we can't defend socialism by the barrel of the gun anymore. That won't work. And actually, Erich Honecker, who's the General Secretary of in GDR and Democratic Republic of Germany, actually takes the opposite view. You might now think of it as the kind of Assad position that says, well, actually, we need to shoot everyone, because otherwise we're going to lose, and it looks like the Chinese are doing okay, and they both think that's their only chance of survival. And in some senses, they're probably both right. But it's interesting there that Gorbachev effectively contains the desire by Honecker and others to actually fire and use their coercive power. So international stuff is the sort of crucible within which these movements have the chance to bubble up and get somewhere they hadn't previously. The second point here is about regime type. Particular regimes are more vulnerable than others. So the regimes that are really vulnerable are effectively these personalistic regimes like Nicholas II or Louis XVI or Somoza in Nicaragua or the Shah in Iran or Philippines with Marcos and so on, which effectively are single entity states. They're really down to that individual and then the personalistic network, the coterie, the family often around them. And the basic reason why these states are so vulnerable is that notion that l'état c'est moi, right? If the state's me, then that's fine when things are going well, it's on you, but it's also on you if things are going badly, and you have nowhere else to go with that. So they're likely to intensify protest around this figure of the individual. At the same time, because those states are effectively cut off from their society, they're sort of suspended above society, then they don't have these intermediary institutions or associations that can sort of sustain some form of negotiation with forms of dissent as it arises. You don't have a means of negotiating your way out of problems. You don't have a way of channeling dissent. You don't have a way of meeting grievances. So there you effectively turn all moderates into radicals, because there's no way for a relatively ordinary, non-transgressive protest to be dealt with before it gets to the individual at the top. So you intensify protest, and you make even relatively normal protest more existential, or at least more radical. Now, the contrast here is with democracies. I mean, my basic position would be there are no revolutions in democracies. It's the other side of this position. Sorry for those who've come to find out how to do that. Unless they degenerate markedly, like the Weimar Republic, or unless they become much more personalistic, i.e. Trump-like, but a lot more personalistic than Donald Trump is currently able to get away with. I'm sure he'd love to be even more so, but at the moment he's being contained relatively successfully. Because what democracies do is they find a way to decompress revolutionary sentiment. It's not that people don't have grievances in democracies, but they have channels through which they're expressed and are considered to be legitimate. And quite quickly, you step outside the bounds of legitimacy, something becomes violent, it becomes extra-constitutional, and usually democratic publics don't find that a reasonable thing to do. They usually stop at that, but look, we have the right to protest and to elect and to petition and do all sorts of things. You go meet your MP. It's not reasonable then to become as transgressive as revolutionary movements effectively need to be. And then a lesson there for the contemporary world is actually there's a lot of people who are not just personalistic, but becoming more so. And it looks like, sometimes from afar, that they're making themselves seem more secure. But actually, in many ways, they're making themselves more vulnerable and more insecure. I'm thinking here of Putin, or Xi Jinping, or Maduro, or Duterte, whoever it might be. So there's a vulnerability with these personalistic regimes, and as regimes become more personalistic in the contemporary world, we may well find, again, this opening to revolutionary currents from below. Final point then, which is the most obvious one, is you just need a sense of crisis. Now, that could be very dramatic, like a defeat in war, so the 1917 example. It could be an economic crisis where the state can no longer provide relatively secure standards of living, or your neighbors might be doing better than you. Or it might actually be relatively small. We've seen recently the Hong Kong protests start over an extradition law, or the Santiago protests start over an increase in metro fares. We've seen the uprising in Beirut begin because of attacks on WhatsApp calls. So the actual catalyst often is something relatively small, and then it snowballs up into something much bigger. It's a stand-in, effectively, for the reasons that you're so dispossessed, exploited, faced with conditions of indignity, and all the rest of it, fundamental inequality. All right, so that's how revolutions often come about. And one reason why we don't get that many revolutionary situations, even though there are many more revolutionary movements, is because that's quite hard. That's quite a lot of stuff that more or less needs to add up before the movement even has an opportunity. International stuff, particular regimes, and then the sense of systemic crisis. What then happens during revolutions? I think two things I want to highlight. The first and most important is that you've effectively got to break the state's hold, or claimed hold, on the use of physical force, their coercive power. Here's all about the role of both state elites and then also the security services. It's effectively a sort of top-down type of issue that needs to take place. And that could be through guerrilla campaigns, or it could be through unarmed programs of civil disobedience. What you do is you break that notion that the state both holds that monopoly and is able to use it. So the older idea was you just confront them head on. People's war, guerrilla campaign, asymmetrical warfare of various kinds, types of terrorism. The new idea is that if you stay unarmed, the state can't really fire on you without looking very bad, without looking extremely illegitimate, particularly as the world is watching, now with media that goes all around the world fairly immediately. But there is a kind of veto power here for the coercive apparatus. This is an example of the Carnation Revolution in Portugal in 1974, where there's actually an alliance between radical military officers and popular groups. They place carnations on tanks, they celebrate with the officers, and that's a way that they actually conduct the revolution to a position of relative success. The other side of that is that point I made earlier. The Hong Kong protesters may do everything right in terms of their protest, but it's very difficult to see how they can win, at least in the short term, while the state remains secure. When you don't get that notion of elite fracture, you don't get the chink in the state, and it looks willing to use its repressive capacities, one way or the other, whether that's the Hong Kong authorities or the PLA and various Chinese officials lurking behind. Second dimension of this is how do you generate your coherent revolutionary movement? And the problem you've got is that societies are diverse peoples with lots of different rationales and lots of different reasons for joining a protest movement. It might be because they don't get enough to eat, it might be because they think something's really unjust, it may be for a whole load of reasons. So how do you generate a coherent movement from this wide array of people? This is particularly true in the contemporary world when you have these enormous coalitions of people. You know, there was a time when 25% of the Hong Kong public were protesting against the leaders there. I mean, that's far higher. I mean, Iran previously was probably the highest, around 10%, but you go back to France and Russia and so on, it's like 1 or 2% of the population. I mean, they're committed, but it ain't a majority. It's a long way away from a majority. So at one point, it made sense to have a committed band of guerrillas or a vanguard party that could lead these movements, seize power, and then institute the revolutionary program. It's a bit harder in these mass, unarmed, huge coalitions of sometimes millions of people. How do you generate coherence? Well, you do so in a couple of different ways. You occupy public places, for example. This is the main square in Kiev during the Euromaidan, the Revolution of Dignity protest towards the end of 2013 and the beginning of 2014. You chant, you have slogans. The notion, I don't know if people have heard in Hong Kong, of be water, be adaptable but strong. It's something that they've used to construct their sense of collective identity. What you do always is have music at the center of a revolutionary coalition. If you think about how do you generate a collective identity, then music is central. You can't have a revolution without music. It's impossible. You might have very different types of revolution, but you need music. Sometimes it might be chanting, but sometimes it might be the appropriation of particular songs. Again, sorry, thinking of Hong Kong, so lots of my examples are from Hong Kong, but they've constructed this effectively a new national anthem for Hong Kong that's now emerged out of the protest movement of people sing everywhere. And what does that do? It overcomes fear. It sort of channels anger. It helps to sustain hope. All of those positive emotions rather than emotions that make you fearful or might make you want to go back home. It gives you strength in numbers, gives you that sense of collective identity. I think the key point here is that I think social technologies of this kind or symbolic technologies of this kind are actually much more important than physical technologies. We spend lots of time thinking about, for example, the role of social media in being necessary for spreading revolutionary movements. And revolutionary movements have always found a way to spread their messages. Once upon a time it was by ship, then it might have been by railway, it was often by word of mouth, could even be how fast someone could run. In Iran it was tape cassettes. They used to get tape cassettes of Ayatollah Khomeini's sermons and play them out over loudspeakers at the end of Friday prayers. So you always find a way of spreading the message. The physical technology to me doesn't matter very much. But the social technology does. You always need these forms of chanting, of music, of collective identity, of colors, of strikes, of demonstrations, of occupations. They always are there in every type of revolutionary struggle, and they do two different things. One is you generate that sense of we feeling, a kind of affective we, a collective entity, we the people, rather than I, or just a particular group. You know, a particular revolutionary group over here and a particular revolutionary group over there, but they disagree on everything. Well, how do you get them together? You get them together through these forms of collective identity, even if it's only temporary. The second thing you do once you have this notion of we the people is you separate the people from the regime. That's why you occupy public places. You say, this is our square. It's not your square. This is our public building, not your public building. So you do two different things. You generate a notion of we the people, and you separate the people from the regime in its castles and its palaces, you know, off on its hills, somewhere else. But the people occupy these places. It's them that are conducting the revolution. So two things then in terms of trajectories, this coercive dimension and then the popular uprising. And we spend a lot of time on the popular uprising part, and it's important, but I do think we need to put it within these various other dimensions as well if we want to make sense of how revolutionary events unfold. Finally, what happens next? I think revolutionary outcomes, we can talk about them ending in a couple of different ways. One is effectively in the short term, just when you're relatively secure from powers. This, in the case of the Bolshevik Revolution, is probably at the end of the Civil War. When you win the Civil War and you think, okay, well now you're relatively secure, how do you start generating your program of transformation? That's a sort of minimal condition. Then a more maximal condition is what happens once you actually start transforming stuff. So you might want to wait a way down the line, sometimes even a generation after the revolution, to say, well, how much has changed here? Have we got a new constitution, a new legal code, a new system of education? Have we transformed gender relations? Have we got new international alliances? You know, to what extent is this now a revolutionary state in that everyday sense of major transformation? Because you can see it's happening here at the end of my story rather than being the story that we effectively start with and then cuts us off from seeing lots of other things. So again, the key point here is that we combine attention to institutional transformations, new constitutions, new legislative environments, major new programs of welfare. Once upon a time, it would have been nationalization programs. These days, it's much more likely to be liberalization programs. You think of shock therapy in the 1990s to the Eastern Central European states. But either way, massive changes to people's everyday lives. But there's also symbolic transformations as well. And one example I wanted to give you, partly because we're not a million miles away from this time of year and partly because you've been listening for a while, so I thought I might wake you up a little bit if I put a Lego picture of Father Christmas up there, is that there's actually a shift in symbolic transformations as well. So the Cubans ban Father Christmas. He's an illegal capitalist alien. He's not authentic to Cuba. He's not authentic to the revolution. So instead, they generate this figure of Don Feliciano. He's got his Guayabera shirt. He's got his fundamental revolutionary beard, and I couldn't find a very good picture of Don Feliciano, so I did Fidel instead, because he's got the beard, which is compulsory. Fidel had a baseball team called Los Barbudos, the bearded ones, which all the revolutionaries had to join. You've got the Guayabera shirt, you've got the revolutionary beard, you don't have the revolutionary cigar, but that probably wasn't very far away. You've got the original champagne socialism here in terms of what he's drinking, but you get the point that the symbolic stuff actually matters here. New festivals. I mean, the French, of course, try and remake the days of the week, the months of the year. You actually start history from time again. You have festivals. You might secularize, or try to. You don't make people not Catholic overnight, as I'm sure some people know, or not. You can't change people's religion very easily, but that doesn't stop people trying. So not everything changes. There's often big variation in revolution to this extent. But don't forget this dimension of symbolic transformation. It's actually one of the hardest things to do. How do you get people thinking anew, afresh, to stop thinking in their old ways and start thinking anew? So what are these symbolic dimensions as well as the institutional transformations we often focus on? Second is the more international dimension. Lots of revolutionary states try and export their revolution, and they do so because they feel vulnerable. They often have domestic enemies, counter-revolutionaries at home. They feel that the environment that they're in is often hostile, and they also feel like they have a message to spread. They want to proselytize the vision. It's not about just being Cuban, the revolution, or French, or Chinese. They actually want to spread this revolution further afield to other people who can benefit from the revolutionary message. So revolutionary states are both twice as likely as non-revolutionary states to induce interstate war, and they're also much more likely to win them. I don't know exactly why they're more likely to win them. It might be because of the intensity of the commitment. It also might be because they just spend more money on military force, which they almost all do. Not the recent model from '89 on, but certainly the model that we saw before then. So there's often a bit more continuity between the old and the new than we sometimes think. They often have to keep on the army, or at least large parts of the army. They get rid of some generals, but not the rank and file. You still need police the day after the revolution. You probably need quite a lot of them, in fact. You need teachers, you need civil servants, you still need local officials. So there's a degree more continuity than we think in terms of these institutions, but nevertheless there is this ongoing attempt to radicalize the message and spread it abroad. And the obvious example here is Cuba. So during the 1960s, Cuba provides military assistance to revolutionary groups in virtually every Latin American country. In the 1970s, they turn their attention to Africa. 12,000 troops go to Ethiopia in 1974. The more remarkable number, 50,000 Cuban troops go to Angola in a mission that lasts for a decade. I mean, it's extraordinary if you think about it. It's a far higher percentage of troops going abroad than the Soviets ever did, particularly to places like Africa, where the Cubans are not racist, unlike very large elements of the Soviet elite. So it's not a question of whether the objective conditions are ripe, it's a question of let's make revolution now, and these characters will do. So in the 1980s, they support revolutionary groups in Nicaragua and El Salvador. In the 90s, and then the early part of this century, they provide lots of assistance to Hugo Chavez, the Bolivarian Revolution. This is actually a march in Caracas. You can see Chavez and Fidel side by side, and Che in the foreground there. It's one reason they're loath to give up Maduro today. There's a long-standing commitment to revolutionary currents in Venezuela and in the continent more generally. But it's not just about armed export. It's also about spreading the message through teachers or professionals or health professionals, engineers, or whatever it might be. So Cuba has had this internationalism that's seen it provide, often free of charge, or at least at very good terms, or some reciprocal arrangement, professionals of various kinds all around the global south. It often funds students from the global south to universities in Cuba, again, free or on some type of reciprocal arrangement. So that's not about spreading your revolution by force of arms, it's about spreading it through your good deeds, through the proselytizing virtues of your internationalism. So we have this idea of direct export. We also have some more indirect ideas of emulation and spread. And the final point I'll say here is it's worth remembering that the outcomes of revolution don't stop. You know, the revolutionary state maintains its notion of revolution in the period after the immediate seizure of power. And that's one reason that we get ongoing contestation within those states. Think about Iran in 1979 and then dealing with the Green Uprising in 2009. Ukraine has effectively been one long contentious episode from the Orange Revolution, more or less, to now. Tunisia and Egypt are still contentious places, even though the revolutionaries there won in 2011. And that's partly because the revolution, once you unlock this idea that you can contest power, and that that's some viable way of meeting grievances, it's quite hard to put people back at home in front of their tellies, being docile, being well-behaved, accepting that their lives aren't very good and they should just get on with it. So once you let the genie of revolution out of the bottle, once you let this contestation spread, particularly in cases where it looks like people have won first time around, then often you have this ongoing revolution in the revolution, sort of constant radicalization, this constant contestation, sometimes low intensity, sometimes fairly high octane. So those are the patterns you can see from the outcomes. What I thought I'd do is now just conclude in two ways. One is talk a little bit about what I think this adds up to, and then just say a couple of things about where we are today, and then I'll open things up. So the point of the book is to try and draw out what I call these patterns in history. What I'm trying to do is get away from the notion there's this kind of identikit revolution, or, you know, a sort of microwave ready meal revolution that, you know, you have your French model and your Chinese model and all the rest of it. You get it off the shelf, chuck it in the microwave, and out you come and you eat it and there's your revolution. It doesn't work like that. Revolutionaries adapt, revolutionary processes adapt. But that doesn't mean we can't find these similarities. When we open up our imagination, when we have a look historically at lots of cases of revolution through world history, then we find that there are these shared patterns, these shared forms, not uniform structures, but shared patterns. And there are 3 dimensions to this picture I wanted to show you when I add that one. And the first is the very well-known Eugène Delacroix picture of the 1830 July Revolution in France. You've got your personification of liberty, Marianne, resplendent bourgeois patriarchal mode with her flag and musket and all the rest of it. You've got a protester from the Gezi protest in 2013 in Istanbul, quite similar type of portrayal, and then a character who's protesting in Palestine in October last year. And I think the sort of shared resemblances, they're not identical pictures, but there are shared forms, shared symbolic script, shared ideas, shared patterns that I think we can find in this picture, which stands in for what I'm trying to do in a bigger way. There's one postscript, actually, to the picture on the bottom right. This character, Aid Abu Amro, was actually shot the next month by Israeli security forces. He thinks they targeted him because his picture became quite widespread. It wasn't fatal, but an interesting reminder of the centrality of coercive pressures and the role of security services to how revolutions unwind. So that's the big picture. What I wanted to do then is just end with where we are today and highlight 2 strands of revolution in the contemporary world. So going back to this notion that there seems to be a lot of revolutionary stuff around, can we draw out a couple of different themes or patterns? And I think we can. I think there are 2 main strands of revolution that we're seeing. The first is this model that we mostly associate with 1989 and lots of big unarmed mass protests since then, and we probably include Hong Kong in this, at least I would, that are plural, horizontalist, egalitarian, decentralized, deliberative in many ways. And the second one is familiar in some ways, the more Bolshevik model, if you like, much more vertical, much more premised around violence, much more hierarchical in terms of its organizational structure, but actually oriented around self-declared non-progressive movements. There's that point I made about not blinkering us or blinding us to the important ways in which these types of movements, from militant Salafism to types of populism to the transnational right, are trying to conduct something that looks, to me at least, a lot like revolutionary programs. So very quickly, what about these 2 models? And I won't spend any time on this because they're probably familiar and I want to leave some time for having a chat. But the idea, I think, behind this first one, what are they complaining about? What's the common theme? It's largely about inequality. There's a reason that it's emerged, particularly over the last 10 years or so, since the financial crisis and the Great Recession that's followed. And I think for me, the stat there that really stands out is that Britain's had its longest period of relative decline in real income since records began, which is in 1815, which is really remarkable if you think about it. For me, the most remarkable thing there is if that's right, I'm surprised that Brexit is the only sort of revolutionary spasm that there's been in this country. You'd almost expect there to have been more. And it's not just what's going on in the West, it's also something that's happening globally. We'll again all know the figures about global inequality. So pick your favorite stat effectively. And I think the big picture here is that in lots of places in the world over particularly the last 10 years, if you imagine the world as a kind of apartment block, the penthouses at the top are bigger and plusher than they've ever been before. You know, people got helicopter pads, into their private jacuzzis where they're drinking Krug, and they're carrying on like you wouldn't believe. Then in the middle of your apartment block, the middle class is feeling a bit squeezed. There's this notion of the middle class poor, right? Job insecurity is a bit down. Real incomes are either down or stagnant, certainly haven't increased. You might sort of renovate your flat a bit or brush it up a bit, but you probably can't move on to anything bigger and better like you thought you would. At the bottom of our building, the basement's effectively been flooded, and no one's coming to fix it. But the real kicker is that the lift between the floors in our apartment block is broken. Social mobility is down everywhere. That promise of going up our apartment block to the top is effectively what I think has happened over the last 10 or 15 years. And the way that these sort of social movement come revolutionary movements deal with this, like Occupy, is say, okay, well, let's get us together, let's align the middle class poor and this precariat that's flooded and no hope of social mobility and working for jobs and no hope of things getting any better, let's align ourselves against the 1% and take back power. Particularly, let's re-establish democracy at the level of a square or a camp. Let's rejuvenate democratic practices against corporate control and against the 1%. It's a re-energizing of democracy against a particular type of elite. I think that's the movement you can associate with Occupy and Podemos and Syriza and various other movements along those lines, and I think, at least partially at least, the movement in Hong Kong and Santiago and elsewhere. The second strand is a little bit different, and there's a lot of license here in putting together militant Salafism, populists of various kinds, and this transnational right. But I think there is something to be said for the similarities in their analysis, in their organization, in their form of legitimation, and so on. And what I just say, this is going to be the closing point, is that these characters are not to be underestimated. And maybe seeing them as revolutionary will start to see the scale of the projects that are going on. On the one hand, one of the interesting things about populists and the new right is that they share lots of the critique of corporate control, of the 1%, and so on. But they align that often to a claim about culture and about race rather than about democracy. So they re-embed a different type of politics from more or less the same place of critique. And it's a toxic blend that in some places at least seems to be working, particularly the further away you actually go from the Anglo-American experience. When it comes to militant Salafism, there's a real corrective that needs to take place. Even though ISIS is kind of defeated immediately, its ideas aren't defeated. And it seems to me unlikely that it won't reappear when opportunity arises. Remember, international opening, particular types of illegitimate states. Perfect example is Syria right now. You know, what do we think is going to happen? Or if Jordan went up in smoke, whatever it might be. So ISIS is around, it's partly relocating, it's partly waiting, it's obviously moved a little bit, some of its affiliates at least, down to the Sahel, that huge area in Africa between the northern deserts and the tropical savanna, from southern Algeria to northern Nigeria. So there's a way there, I think, that these right-wing movements are in many ways speaking to a very important current of revolution in the contemporary world. If we're in this moment, which I think we are, of global turbulence, then what I think we'll see is that we're in a time that's also going to be extremely revolutionary, and both of these strands are going to be alive over the next few years and tell us a lot about how politics in various places develops. Thanks a lot. That's what I got.